The governor of Merv opened the letter and immediately ordered poison for his entire family. Not because the Mongols had arrived, they were still 3 weeks away. Not because the city couldn't defend itself. It had walls 40 feet high and 600,000 people inside. He ordered the poison because the letter contained something more lethal than any army: mathematics. The calculation was simple. Resist and watch your children tortured before your eyes, then die. Surrender and 70% of your population gets executed anyway. Or take the third option the letter never explicitly offered, but somehow made inevitable. Die now, on your own terms, with your family intact. Within 5 days, the city's apothecaries had run out of poison. Within 10 days, the canals were clogged with bodies. Within 2 weeks, entire neighborhoods stood empty. Doors hanging open, meals left uneaten on tables. When the Mongol army finally arrived at the gates of one of the world's largest cities, they found it had already begun burying itself. This happened in Merv in 1241, and it happened in dozens of other cities across 2 continents. Not through siege, not through disease, not through battle, through a letter that arrived 3 weeks early and contained nothing but verifiable facts. This is how the Mongols conquered half the known world, not by destroying cities, but by writing them instructions on how to destroy themselves. The letter arrived 3 weeks before the army. It came on horseback, carried by a single rider wearing Mongol colors, but speaking the local language fluently. He did not demand entry to the city. He did not threaten the guards. He simply handed the sealed document to the gate commander and rode away. The letter was addressed to the city's governor, but its contents were designed for wider circulation. It was written in multiple languages. It carried no elaborate calligraphy. The writing was functional, direct, calculated for mass reproduction. Within hours, copies were being transcribed. Within days, every literate person in the city had read it or heard it read aloud. Within 2 weeks, the city's population had decreased by half, not through evacuation, through self-termination. This happened repeatedly across Central Asia and Eastern Europe between 1219 and 1242. In Nishapur, in Merv, in Urgench, in Kiev, in Lahore, cities with populations exceeding 100,000 experienced mass deaths before Mongol forces arrived at their walls. The deaths were not caused by siege, disease, or preliminary raids. They were caused by information. This is what the letters actually said, and how they functioned as weapons more efficient than any siege engine the medieval world had ever seen. The Mongol Empire did not expand through military superiority alone. It expanded through information architecture. By 1220, Genghis Khan controlled the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. This expansion occurred in roughly 2 decades. Traditional military analysis attributes this to cavalry tactics, composite bows, and organizational structure. But those elements explain how battles were won. They do not explain how cities surrendered before battles began. The Mongol communication system explains that. It was called the Yam, a postal relay network that could transmit messages across the empire at speeds exceeding 100 miles per day. Stations were positioned at 25-mile intervals. Fresh horses were kept ready. Riders were granted absolute priority on all roads. The system was protected by law. Violation meant execution. Messages could travel from Karakoram to the Western Front in less than 2 weeks. European communication systems of the same period required months for equivalent distances. This speed differential created an intelligence asymmetry. Mongol commanders knew what was happening across their empire in near real time. Their opponents operated on information that was weeks or months old. But the yam was not just used for military coordination. It was used for psychological projection. And the primary instrument of that projection was the surrender letter. The letters followed a standardized template. They were not unique documents. They were mass-produced communications designed for scalability. Surviving examples from the 1220s and 1230s show consistent structural elements. First, identification. The letter established sender authority by listing Genghis Khan's titles and territorial holdings in exhaustive detail. This section could exceed 500 words. It was not boastful. It was documentary. It established that the sender controlled territories the recipient had heard of, creating geographic context for the threat. Second, historical precedent. The letter listed cities that had already fallen, not just names, specific details. Population counts before conquest. Casualty figures after resistance. Survivor numbers after surrender. These figures were often exaggerated, but not fantastical. They remained within the range of believability. A city of 80,000 being reduced to 15,000 was documented. A city of 120,000 being completely destroyed was documented. The pattern was clear. Resistance resulted in near total mortality. Surrender resulted in partial survival. Third, terms. The letter specified exactly what surrender required. Open the gates. Provide food and supplies for the army. Surrender all weapons. Provide craftsmen, engineers, and siege experts for Mongol service. Provide a population census. Provide tribute calculated as a percentage of assessed wealth. The terms were non-negotiable, but they were clear. Clarity was essential. Ambiguity created resistance. Precision created compliance. Fourth, timeline. The letter specified when the Mongol army would arrive. Not approximately. Exactly. The army will reach your walls on this date. You have until that date to comply. After that date, terms are void. This deadline was always accurate. Mongol forces arrived when the letter said they would arrive. This reliability was crucial. It transformed the letter from a threat into a schedule. Fifth, consequences. The final section described what would happen if the city resisted. This section was the longest. It was also the most specific. It did not use vague language like destruction or suffering. It used concrete details. Every man of fighting age will be executed. Every woman will be distributed to Mongol soldiers. Every child under a certain height will be enslaved. Every building will be dismantled stone by stone. Every irrigation canal will be destroyed. Every tree will be cut down. Every field will be salted. The city will be erased. Not conquered, erased. These were not exaggerations. In 1221, after the city of Nishapur killed a Mongol commander during a previous campaign, Genghis Khan's daughter demanded special terms for its recapture. When the city fell after a 3-day siege, Mongol forces spent 10 days systematically executing the entire population. Persian historian Juvaini, writing 30 years after the event, stated that even cats and dogs were killed. The city's head count was maintained by stacking skulls in pyramids, separated by gender. Survivors were not recorded because survivors were not permitted. The population before the siege was estimated at 1.8 million. After the massacre, the city was uninhabitable for decades. This was documented. This was known, and this documentation was included in subsequent surrender letters sent to other cities. The letters did not function through fear alone. They functioned through calculation. They provided recipients with precise information necessary to make a rational decision. Option A, surrender, results in X percentage survival and Y level of resource extraction. Option B, resistance, results in 0 survival and total erasure. The choice was not emotional, it was mathematical. But the letters created a secondary effect that was not immediately obvious. They created a prisoner's dilemma within the target population. In game theory, a prisoner's dilemma occurs when individual rational self-interest produces collectively suboptimal outcomes. The surrender letters created exactly this dynamic. Consider a city of 100,000 people receiving a Mongol letter in 1220. The letter states, the army will arrive in 3 weeks. The governor must decide, surrender or resist. But the governor's decision is not the only decision being made. Every merchant, craftsman, religious leader, military officer, and property owner is also making calculations. If the city surrenders, I will survive but lose significant wealth and status. If the city resists and wins, I will retain everything. If the city resists and loses, I will die. The problem is that individual survival does not require the city's survival. An individual can survive by fleeing before the Mongols arrive. They can also survive by opening the gates themselves. They can also survive by eliminating anyone who might organize resistance. This created cascading fractures within target populations. Wealthy merchants began evacuating with portable assets. Military commanders began negotiating private surrender terms. Religious leaders began preaching acceptance of God's will. Property owners began liquidating holdings. These were rational individual decisions, but collectively they destroyed the city's ability to organize defense. By the time the Mongol army arrived, the city was already fractured into competing survival strategies. Resistance became impossible, not because the population lacked courage, because they lacked coordination. The letter had transformed a unified city into a collection of individuals, each calculating their own optimal outcome. But there was a third effect, more insidious than fear or fracture. The letters created temporal pressure that induced psychological collapse. The 3-week timeline was not arbitrary, it was calibrated. 3 weeks was long enough for the information to circulate completely, long enough for the reality to be accepted, long enough for resistance plans to be proposed, debated, and abandoned, but not long enough for external help to arrive, not long enough for effective fortifications to be built, not long enough for the population to psychologically adapt to the threat. The timeline created a waiting period where action was impossible, but anticipation was mandatory. During this period, the city existed in a state of frozen dread. Normal economic activity ceased. Markets closed. Construction stopped. Religious services intensified. Crime increased. Families made contingency plans. Some planned escape. Some planned hiding. Some planned suicide. The suicide option was not irrational given the information provided. The letter specified that resistors would be executed after torture. It specified that women would be enslaved and distributed. It specified that children would be taken. For many families, particularly those of high status, these outcomes were worse than death. Suicide allowed them to control the manner and timing of their end. It allowed them to die with their families intact. It allowed them to avoid the specific degradations the letter had detailed. Contemporary accounts from multiple cities describe similar patterns. Wealthy families poisoning themselves together, military officers falling on their swords, entire households hanging themselves from roof beams. These were not isolated incidents. They were systematic responses to calculated incentives. The most detailed account comes from the fall of Merv in 1291. Merv was one of the largest cities in the world at that time, with an estimated population between 600,000 and 1 million. It was a major center of Islamic learning, with libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. It had survived for over 1,000 years. The Mongol letter arrived in February 1221. It gave the city 4 weeks to surrender. Contemporary chronicler Ibn al-Athir describes the population's response. He states that many families chose immediate death over waiting for the Mongols. He specifies methods: poison from apothecaries, drowning in canals, knife wounds to major blood vessels. He notes that the city's religious scholars debated whether suicide under these circumstances violated Islamic law. The consensus was that it did, but the debates continued because people needed justification for decisions they had already made. When Mongol forces arrived in March, the city's governor attempted negotiation. The Mongols accepted his surrender, then requested that the population assemble outside the walls for a census. This was standard procedure. The population was divided into groups. Craftsmen with useful skills were separated and sent to other parts of the empire. Young women were distributed. Everyone else was executed. The process took 4 days. Tolui Khan, the commanding general, reported the completion to his father. The estimated death toll was 700,000 people. But here is the crucial detail. When the Mongols entered the city, they found it partially depopulated. Entire neighborhoods were empty. Houses contained bodies of families who had died before the army arrived. The Mongols had expected resistance. They found a city that had already begun destroying itself. This pattern repeated across Central Asia. In Urgench, modern-day Turkmenistan, the 1221 siege found similar conditions. The city's population had dropped significantly before Mongol forces breached the walls. In Herat, captured in 1221 and rebelled in 1210, the second siege found the population depleted, not by the first siege, but by suicides that occurred during the waiting period before the second siege. In each case, the letter created conditions where death before conquest seemed preferable to life under Mongol terms. The effectiveness of this system created a feedback loop. Each successful conquest provided documentation for the next letter. Each documented massacre made the next letter more credible. Each credible letter reduced the next city's resistance. The Mongols were not just conquering territory, they were refining a communication protocol that converted information into capitulation. By 1237, when Mongol forces under Batu Khan invaded Kievan Rus, the surrender letter had been perfected through 17 years of field testing. The Russian principalities received letters describing what had happened in Central Asia, Persia, and the Caucasus. The letters were accurate. Batu Khan's forces did not need to exaggerate. The historical record provided sufficient evidence. When the Mongols reached Kiev in 1240, the city's population had already been traumatized by 2 years of waiting and watching other cities fall. Contemporary chronicles describe panic, flight, and despair. The primary chronicle, a key historical source, describes people abandoning their homes and possessions, fleeing into forests where they would likely die from exposure, because forest death seemed preferable to Mongol capture. Kiev's siege lasted from November through December 1240. The city fell on December 6th, but Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, a papal envoy who visited the ruins in 1246, describes finding mass graves that predated the siege. He describes neighborhoods that had been abandoned before the Mongols arrived. He describes evidence of collective suicide pacts. He estimates that the city's population had decreased by 30 to 40% before the siege began. The Mongols conquered a city that was already collapsing. The letter had done its work before the army arrived. This raises a question that medieval chroniclers struggle to answer. If the letters caused such devastation, why did cities not simply surrender immediately? Why wait 3 weeks in agony when the outcome seemed predetermined? The answer reveals the final layer of the letter's effectiveness. Immediate surrender was often impossible because city governance structures could not process the decision quickly enough. Medieval cities operated through consensus among multiple power centers. The governor needed approval from military commanders, wealthy merchants, religious authorities, and guild leaders. These groups had conflicting interests. Military commanders wanted to fight. Merchants wanted to negotiate. Religious leaders wanted divine intervention. Guild leaders wanted guarantees about their members. Reaching consensus required time, but the 3-week waiting period did not provide time for consensus building. It provided time for consensus destruction. As the deadline approached, the faction supporting resistance would watch support erode daily. Merchants would flee. Soldiers would desert. Religious leaders would declare the situation hopeless. By the time the deadline arrived, the resistance faction had lost the political capital necessary to organize defense. Surrender became the only viable option, not because it was chosen, but because alternatives had been systematically eliminated. The letter did not force a decision. It structured the decision space so that only one outcome remained possible. The Mongol letter system functioned until the empire's expansion stalled in the 1260s. It stopped working not because cities learned to resist it, but because the Mongol Empire stopped expanding rapidly enough to maintain the system's credibility. The letters relied on continuous conquest. Each letter referenced recent victories. Each recent victory made the next letter credible. When expansion slowed, the temporal gap between letters and conquest widened. Cities began to doubt whether the Mongol army would actually arrive on schedule. Doubt created space for resistance. Resistance created Mongol defeats. Defeats undermined the letter system's fundamental premise that Mongol conquest was inevitable. By 1280, the empire had fragmented into 4 khanates. Communication between them deteriorated. The Yam system declined. Letters could no longer cite empire-wide conquests because the empire was no longer unified. Local commanders still sent surrender letters, but those letters lacked the imperial authority that had made earlier versions effective. Recipients could verify sender authority, They could check whether recent claims were accurate. They could calculate whether resistance might succeed. The information asymmetry that had made the letters devastating had been neutralized by time and fragmentation. But for 60 years, between 1220 and 1280, the Mongol surrender letter functioned as the most effective psychological weapon in medieval warfare. It killed cities without siege engines. It conquered populations without battles. It transformed information into mortality. The letters did not cause cities to commit suicide through some mystical power. They caused suicide through rational calculation. They provided individuals with accurate information about their options. They created decision structures where death seemed optimal. They imposed timelines that prevented adaptation. They fractured communities into competing survival strategies. The result was mass death before conquest, systematic and reproducible across dozens of cities. Modern psychological operations theory recognizes this pattern. Information can be weaponized, not through deception, but through precision. The most effective psychological operations do not lie. They tell carefully selected truths that shape decision spaces. They provide targets with accurate information about negative outcomes while restricting information about alternatives. They impose temporal pressure that prevents deliberative reasoning. They create conditions where targets make decisions that serve the attacker's interests while believing they are acting in their own self-interest. The Mongol surrender letters pioneered this approach 800 years ago. No single letter survives in its original form. What remain are descriptions in chronicles written by Persian, Chinese, Russian, and European historians who witnessed or documented the conquests. What remains are the documented population drops in cities that received the letters. What remains are mass graves that predate sieges. What remains are the archaeological signatures of cities that stopped functioning before they were captured. The letters themselves have degraded into dust, but their effects are preserved in the historical record as permanent reminders that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not the one that destroys walls, but the one that destroys the will to defend them. History does not always kill with swords. Sometimes it kills with schedules, terms, and the calm certainty of documented precedent delivered 3 weeks in advance.